and welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I am taking you through another line in the f3 Nimzo-Indian. We have wrapped up all of the time we're going to spend on this move d5 by black. In my opinion, most of the time it's not a great move, although there are a few lines where black can equalize there, as we talked about. Now, I'm going to move on to a rather perplexing fourth move that many of you may face a little bit more rarely in the f3 Nimzo. So let's jump right into it. The move is 4 kingside castles, and you're going to arrive there by the normal move order: d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop e4, f3, and here black is going to castle. And if you guys were paying attention in the first lectures, you might remember this move, because this was one of the ways black could arrive at this idea of playing the move d5, and then we would be back in those lines that we've talked about. However, while I was sort of trash talking this move order in order to get to d5, the move 4 kingside castles is actually a very well respected line. However, they normally don't combine it with this move d5 at the top level. So what's the idea of 4 kingside castles? Well, black is simply getting the king out of the center, not committing these pawns to either c5 or d5, and now black's next move is actually going to be with the kingside knight. And believe it or not, there are actually 2 different options here. Black can go knight h5, which is going to be the main focus of this lecture, and then black can also go knight e8. And while these 2 moves may not seem like the most testing of the f3 Nimzo-Indian, we'll come to find out that these are actually some of the most combative lines in the entire opening. So as I said, we're going to mainly focus on knight h5 tonight, and if we have some extra time, I'll begin discussing knight e8, but let's start with this move in our main game here between Mamedyarov and Sergey Fedorchuk. So in the game, what is the point of knight h5? Well, it very directly is stopping white's next move. And what is white's next move? Well, white wants to play the move e4, of course. And this, of course, would be a little bit of a mistake in light of queen to h4 check, when after the king moves, or pawn to g3, the knight is coming to g3 regardless, and thanks to this pin, white is simply going to be losing in this case. So, knight h5 is a direct attempt to stop the move e4. So what can white do in response to this? Well, I think you already saw me highlight the move knight h3, and I think this is going to be white's best move in the position, simply defending against the threat of queen h4, also preparing to guard some of these dark squares, number 1, and secondly, to bring this knight back to f2, where we can come back to support this pawn to e4 push. Now, if black were to try this move queen h4, we are ready to respond either with g3 or the simple move knight f2, when knight g3 no longer works because our rook is actually going to be defended. And here, this would just be a simple mistake by black. This queen doesn't belong on h4, and eventually the queen is going to have to return back to its starting square. Black is just busy losing time here. Both g3 and knight f2, very good for white. So, what is the point of this knight h5 move? Is it just a mistake in light of knight h3? The queen h4 idea is not a good one for black, so what is black's point? Well, black is, as we said, focusing on stopping e4 in some very creative ways here. And the point of this knight h5 move is to follow it up with this move of f5. And f5, of course, is only playable because we did get this knight out of the way on f6. And I've had some people tell me that this is a very tough line for white to crack. There are a few main moves here. The move e4 can be played anyways. Bishop g5 is actually the most common. You'll see a lot of players play e3 as well, just sort of biding their time, waiting to play e4 before they get developed. But I think white's best line is actually the simple move knight back to f2. And I'll get into why I think this is the best line in a moment. Notably, in regards to e4, if you play it immediately after f takes e4, it's actually a little bit awkward for white to try to take this pawn back, because again, queen h4 check is going to start becoming a legitimate threat. e4 is simply hanging, of course, and knight f2 is now unplayable. Looks pretty tough on all regards. King d2 is playable, This is not capturable because the knight is hanging, but this is, of course, a bad position for white. So after f takes e4, white is not able to recapture the pawn directly. You have to insert a move like bishop g5 before recapturing. And initially, this position may look quite favorable to white. You have this knight sort of stranded on the side of the board. You have an extra piece developed, but the fact of the matter is, I think white is in a little bit of danger of actually being worse. Whenever you have this slightly strange pawn structure in the center, it's actually going to be black who has some targets. If you imagine a few moves, I'm not saying these are the best moves, but if you imagine that the structure were to change in this manner, white plays some move like bishop e2, knight f6, knight f2, let's say b6, white gets castled. You can easily imagine that a6 is going to be a big weakness. Black is able to occupy the c5 square, and it's going to be black who has all the targets in the position. And I think if the game were to develop along these lines, white would simply be much worse. So what's the big deal? How is white going to be able to combat this idea? Well, I think it all starts with this move, knight f2, which is actually the fourth most common move, but it has been played by some very good players, the likes of which are, Wesley and Mamedyarov, amongst some very good other players as well. So what's the point of knight f2? Well, we'll see in the game. Fedorchuk plays knight to c6, and now white does play this move e4. Now in the game, we actually don't see f takes e4 immediately. It could have been played here, but maybe we'll see what Mamedyarov's idea is a little bit later on in the game. Instead, we see e4, d6 by Fedorchuk, delaying the capture for a few moments, bishop d3 by Mamedyarov, and now after f takes e4, we don't actually see Shak recapturing with the f pawn, which is probably the most natural to most of you. Of course, this is why we play f3 to control the e4 square. But once again, this structure is going to end up favoring black in the long run if white isn't very accurate. And so to avoid this sort of structural weakness, we actually see Shak capturing with a piece on e4. And this is the main idea behind this move, knight f2. It's to capture on the e4 square with a piece and not a pawn. Now, why is this so much better? Well, because it gives white a very clear line of active play. In this case, we're going to see white actually take with the bishop, because if you take with the knight, e5 might immediately be making a threat, whereas when we take with the bishop, after e5, we have this pawn well defended already. So that's the little subtlety there by Shak, just making sure he doesn't lose the tempo to e5 after capturing. So bishop takes e4 was played in the game, and now we do see that black admits this knight is misplaced and brings it back to f6. By the way, I want to take this opportunity to discuss the move knight f4. It's sort of been lurking in the air for a few turns now. Black could have played it at a few different moments, but what do you think the response to knight f4 is going to be in this case? And I'll ask the chat room this one. What are we doing about knight f4? What's the point? What is the point? Anybody in the chat room know the points? I should probably refresh. Yes, I should have refreshed. G3 has been suggested, castles has been suggested. So in this case, both of those moves are going to be good. But there is a very, very surprising move that is also going to be very good for white. And we'll see why in a little bit. But that move I wanted to suggest is the move bishop takes f4. And this is going to move that looks horribly unnatural to many of you. It looks sort of anti-positional to give away your bishop pair in this manner. But as we'll see in the game, white's play really is coming along this diagonal. And I think in this particular variation, it's going to lead to an advantage for white to play on this diagonal. And so I want you guys to keep this idea in mind. Bishop takes f4 looks entirely unnatural, at least to my eyes, but it does turn out to be a very good move in many cases because it loosens, it weakens black's control over these kingside light squares, and that's what's going to make the difference in this game. So In this particular instance, though, castles in g3 are both great moves. I would advise a little bit of caution whenever you play g3, as it does weaken some squares around your own king a little bit, which I want to talk about in a moment. But ignoring it in this case is perfectly fine. But that's with the caveat that actually, if you just castle here, you're probably going to end up capturing this knight in just a few turns anyways. But knight f4 not played in the game. Instead, Fedorchuk chose knight back to f6, hitting this bishop. Of course, our play is on this diagonal. That's why we captured with a piece on e4, so white saves the bishop, bishop c2. And now black's task is to find a way to get some active counterplay here. So what is going to be the idea for active counterplay in this case? Well, against this structure, all of these 4 kingside castle lines really have the same idea for getting counterplay. Number 1, you sort of take over the dark squares with a move like e5, and number 2, you start to target this pawn on c4. This is the main idea for black to achieve counterplay. So in this game, we're going to see that Shak's play on this diagonal is actually simply coming far too quickly for black to handle, and so this counterplay doesn't really matter. But then we're going to see another few examples where black sort of goes after this directly and what you can do to sort of combat that. So let's take a look. Bishop c2 played in the game, and Fedorchuk goes e5. In this case, Mamedyarov takes the opportunity to castle kingside, and now we do in fact see b6 by black, probably with this idea in mind. Now, remember when I said knight f4 and bishop takes f4 was a perfectly reasonable idea? Well, Shak sort of proves that point here by playing the move bishop g5. He's not afraid of trading this bishop for the knight with the idea of weakening this kingside structure for black. Black plays h6, and we're not going to see the immediate capture. The immediate capture actually is possible and probably good, but simply bishop h4. Queen e8 was Fedorchuk's idea, and now queen d3, and we're beginning to see Shak's idea sort of develop. In the game, black really only had one move at this point to still stay in the fight here, and that move was knight e7 with the idea of going for a quick bishop f5, and white could do a number of things here, including simply g4, trying to stop this idea and renew the threats, including taking this knight on f6, including taking on e5, including playing the move c5. Really, white could play anything here and have a bit of an edge, but in the game, black actually blundered immediately with queen f7, which is simply losing to this kingside attack. Shak found the best way forward, playing knight g4, again removing this piece from the defense of the kingside. Knight e7 was played, but now it's just a bit too late for this idea. Bishop takes f6, again giving up the bishop to remove the light square defender. Bishop f5, queen d2, and here black actually just resigns on move 19. So this was quite the miniature here, and in fact it is going to be quite relevant to our opening theory. Of course, black messed up a few points at a few points along the way, but I wanted to start with this game to really highlight one of white's main plans, and I think this is the best plan for white to go for in the majority of cases that we're going to look at. So let's jump through it one more time and see what happened. We had, of course, the opening moves to the Nimzo-Indian, this kingside castles move, a3 takes, now knight h5 by black, and knight h3 is our response, f5 to stop e4, we go knight f2, knight c6, and e4. And again, my point is that many times after f takes e4, we're actually going to reply to this with the move knight takes e4. And if f takes e4 had been played immediately, I do think I'm going to recommend the move knight takes e4. I should mention that this has literally never been played, f takes e4 here, so it's a bit silly to call it part of the opening theory, but I am going to say I like this idea for white sort of the best. And play would likely continue how we saw it continue in the game, with this bishop coming to d3, e5 happening, bishop c2 to defend the pawn, castles, and white launching a kingside attack. But of course, in the game, takes wasn't immediately played, d6 first, bishop d3, takes, knight f6, bishop back to c2, e5, castles, and here I think b6 is sort of the beginning of the end for black, I should say. Again, black wanted to find active counterplay on the queen side, but the king's side was just a bit too weak for this sort of counterplay to work. What could black do instead? Well, it turns out that the slightly ugly looking idea may be to put this pawn on d5. For example, takes, and d5, and white is, again, I think going to be a bit better in this case, but black is in there with a fight, fighting back for some of these central squares, and black is going to be able to help defend the king a bit more in this case without getting so sort of rolled over in the center of the board. With that in mind, there are some other ideas for black as well. For example, all of these lines that I'm talking about in this first game involve black capturing on e4 and opening up this center. Of course, this is not something black is forced to do, and so we're going to examine the case of when black sort of leaves this pawn in tension for a little bit, and then eventually plays this move f4. This is another very important idea to keep in mind here for black. But first, questions on this particular line, where black is capturing on e4, and I'm going to recommend in the majority of cases you take on e4 with a piece. And we're going to see a little bit later in the lecture, this isn't always the case. Sometimes, depending on how the game has gone, it is going to be a good idea to take this back with the pawn, but our main idea with this knight f2 move is going to be to recapture on e4 with the piece. All right, questions here though, questions here. What if queen h4 after knight e4? I will get to mentioning that as well, actually, but that's a good question. In this particular situation, we're taking with the bishop, of course. If here, takes, queen h4, the idea is going to be to go g3, and the queen just simply has to retreat and will develop as normal. And we'll see a slight improvement for black if black does want to go for this idea, and what white should do in response. Patrick has a general question. What happens when your opponents work to get out of theory instantly? Well, I should mention that e4 here, this exact position with knight f2 has only been played 22 times in history, right? Like, this line isn't the most, okay, I should amend that, not in history. It appears 22 times in the database of titled players that I'm working with here. So this knight f2 line is a bit of a sideline, and so it's a little bit of a stretch to call this stuff heavily theory-based. That's why I'm focusing on the idea of knight f2 being to capture on e4 with the piece and use this open diagonal to your advantage. And I should say, while this knight h5 move might be qualified as a bit of a sideline, it's got some title recognition behind it, I should say, because some very strong players have played this line, and it's something that I have actually faced quite a bit in my serious chess games. What about g4 here? g4, I think, is an idea that they sometimes do, combined with this move of e3. And to be honest with you, I don't think any of these lines are ever very good for white. I'm struggling to come up with the exact position where I was looking at it, but yeah, g4 is just not going to be the ticket here. It's a little too weakening of your king side. All right, let us move on. Why doesn't white first play bishop g5 and then knight f2? Well, bishop g5 is actually the most common move here, and this is perfectly playable, but I actually think that you improve black's queen by playing this move bishop g5. Now, in many cases where black has taken, we take with a piece, they play e5 and take here. We're going to be dealing with the queen sitting directly opposite our king. And yeah, this is actually the line where they go g4, and I simply don't like this from white. Whenever you're playing against a sideline, it is tempting to go sort of wild in your preparation and prepare a line like bishop g5 and g4, but I think it's a little bit unnecessary. And the reason for that is that when it is a little bit less common of a line, the fact of the matter tends to be that your opponent's going to be more prepared for you than you in the ensuing complications. And I should mention, I don't even think this line is that good for white. I think black equalizes without too many difficulties here due to the weaknesses created by this move g4. So yeah, bishop g5 is a playable move if that's the route you want to go. I am recommending this move knight f2 because I think it gives white a simple, nice, small edge that can very, very quickly turn into a big edge, as we saw in this game. But let us move on from this idea now. So this game shows how the game is likely going to develop if you do face an f takes e4 at some moment. Black is going to try to get counterplay on the dark squares and with something like this, and white is simply going to castle kingside and look to target the weak light squares on black's kingside. But let us move on to game number 2, which is going to be between two English chess legends. Of course, English, either number 1 or number 2, he bounces back and forth with David Howe a little bit, talking about Gawain Jones, and of course, the ever-famous Lawrence Trent. They had a game in this exact line, and it was quite an instructive one. So I wanted to take a look at it here. And what idea this game is going to show is going to be, again, what I talked about if black isn't playing this move, f takes e4. Let's just get to our position here. Takes, knight h5, knight h3, f5, knight f2 once again is Gawain Jones's choice. Here we see the move d6 once again, e4, and now rather than the move, d6 is the new move. Again, in the previous game we saw knight c6. d6 is a bit more common, but nothing too crazy. e4, and now Lawrence Trent chooses this move, queen to e8. So of course now black leaves these pawns in tension a little bit longer. Again, our move here is going to be bishop d3 with the idea of recapturing on e4, not necessarily with the pawn, but either with the bishop or the knight, leaving this diagonal open so we can achieve some play on this diagonal rather than have a silly looking bishop stuck behind the pawn against the move e5. So bishop d3 played in the game, and then Lawrence Trent goes e5, not necessarily taking on e4 and opening up this diagonal. Now white is met with a choice. This position has actually occurred a couple times. In one of the games between two 2600s, we saw the move e takes f5 be played, but this didn't lead to much for white. In fact, I think white got into a little bit of trouble with the king in the center. So I like Gawain Jones's move, the simple castles. What's the downside to this move? Well, now Lawrence Trent is able to block up the center with the move f4. And this is going to be an idea you have to look out for. I think the move order that Lawrence Trent chose was a pretty good one, but just as an FYI, I know for a fact I've played some games where black is just playing f4 here immediately after e4, and here the ideas are just going to largely be the same as in the game. So, in the game though, queen e8, bishop d3, e5 castles, and then f4. Why do I think this move order is better by Lawrence Trent? Well, this queen is well placed on e8 in my opinion, and this bishop is perhaps suboptimally placed if this diagonal isn't actually opening. So I think this is a better version for black than the immediate f4. That's what I'm trying to say. So chat room, how do you want to approach this position? Does the chat have any ideas of what white should be doing against this move f4? And Pippenchuk has phrased his answer in the form of a question, perhaps in memory of the great Alex Trebek. And he says, after black plays f4, why doesn't white play c5? And in fact, his question is the answer, as I said. This move c5 is actually going to be a great idea for white in this position. What is the point? Well, the point is this pawn on c4 is sort of useless. If white were to play a bad move, like the move d5, then these pawns are really just stepping on each other's toes, and white is going to be significantly worse. So white shouldn't be afraid to gambit this pawn with the move c5, opening up some diagonals and starting to challenge black's big pawn chain. And let me reiterate, if there's one thing you shouldn't do in this position, it's play the move d5. This just allows black to get a total bind on the position, and in the long run, you're likely going to get checkmated in classical King's Indian style. For example, let's just give black a few moves. Let's say black gets a setup looking something like this. Bishop c2, knight f6, g5, h5. This is white's future. And you might think it's a little bit silly to give black all these moves, But the fact of the matter is, I challenge you to find an active plan for white after this move, d5, and let's say b6 first, just stopping c5. And I don't think you're going to come up with one. This is just going to be really, really tough to deal with. So, in these positions, don't sort of take them lightly. White's position is actually very much in danger of becoming worse if you play a few nonchalant moves, right? These ideas come reasonably quickly, as well as b6 for black. So c5, you must play actively whenever black tries to shut down this center. You can't take your time with these things. Lawrence plays the most combative moves here and takes on c5, and Gawain Jones follows up with queen b3 check. Now if bishop e6, of course there's a problem on b7, something like queen e6, bishop c4 is a problem, so king h8 must be played. And here, Gawain Jones plays a pretty interesting move. He plays the move a4. And what's the point? The point is to activate this bishop, potentially along this diagonal, and also to meet something with like b6 with an eventual move like a5. And this is the problem with black playing this way with e5, f4. White is actually just going to be able to rip open the queen side immediately and ensure that it's not going to turn into this checkmating race like a normal King's Indian. Black is going to have to meet white on the queen side because the play is just coming a bit too quickly. With that in mind, though, Lawrence, of course, did not resign the game after a4. He plays the move b6, trying to shore up his queen side a little bit. But it's worth noting how far away this seemingly distant pipe dream of playing g5, h5, g4 really is. Black simply does not have the time to play like this. This bishop is coming to a3, this pawn is coming under fire, and white is going to have a lot of active play here. For example, something like knight bd7 is perfectly playable, but when you face it with d takes c5, you start to realize already there are too many threats over here to ignore. So something like c6, rook fd1, and white is just going to be the more active side in this case. So Lawrence immediately meets Gawain on the queen side with the move b6, and we do see d takes c5 by white. Don't get too attached to having some sort of massive center here. Your play is on the queen side now that the center is closed. Again, it does you absolutely no good to play the move d5. This is going to be a huge mistake, shutting off your active diagonal, shutting off any play on the d file, and sort of, once again, giving black a free hand on the king side. So d takes c5, great move by Gawain, bishop e6, and here perhaps it would have been a bit more accurate for Gawain to keep the bishops on the board and just move this queen, something like queen b1, queen b4, queen b5 even, but instead Gawain chooses bishop c4, which is fine for white. We see takes, queen f7, queen d5 is his choice, and now after queen takes d5, e takes d5, knight f6, bishop a3 with some threats, rook e8, and c4. I sort of blazed through those last few moves, but the fact of the matter is white succeeded in changing the feel of the game. Black with f4 was threatening to turn it into a very one-sided battle with the queen side locked up and a checkmating race on the king side, and instead Gawain Jones took control of the game immediately and diverted all the attention to the queen side, where white is going to have some edge due to the spatial advantage. So that is the way to play in this particular, against this particular idea of locking down the center. B takes c5 was Lawrence Trent's choice, and now rook b1 is accurate and good, just activating this rook immediately. Knight a6, knight d3, and it's clear that black is going to be dealing with these weaknesses for the rest of the game. And eventually, Gawain does go on to win this game, thanks to these active pieces and this myriad of weaknesses that black is having to deal with here. So I won't show you any more of this game. Just quickly scrolling through a few moves, you see he gets this nice rook on b5, and just all of his pieces actively placed, all of black's pieces passively placed. It's just a dream position. Eventually taking on e5 and winning a nice bishop versus knight endgame with a powerful a-pawn that's simply impossible to stop. So what happened this game? Let us review one more time. We see now this idea, again, knight f2, e4. Again, our point is to capture back with a piece on the e4 square. Queen e8, e5, and f4 is Lawrence Trent's idea, locking down the center, and you see immediately that white goes for this idea of c5, immediately opening up the diagonal, challenging these dark squares, challenging the queen side. That's the way you have to play in order to counteract this f4 idea. So let's talk about a couple caveats here, because of course, black doesn't have to play exactly like Lawrence Trent played. So let's say, once again, black immediately goes with this move f4. I think, again, bishop d3 is a perfectly fine move. Let's say e5 and castles getting developed. And then let's say black plays something a little bit more tenacious, like the move b6, trying to guard c5. What do you think the right idea is going to be here for white against this idea of b6? What do you think, chat? What do you think? And yeah, of course the idea is not to give up on the c5 idea, you simply play it anyways. It's still going to be correct, it's the same principle. Whether or not it ends up being a pawn sacrifice is sort of irrelevant, right? We're not really worried about this extra pawn for black, it's all about active play on the queen's side. Chat room is spot on with this one. So that's all there really is to say on this idea here. Basically, e5, f4, c5 is a crucial break to keep in mind, and that is sort of the story to be had. There. And I should say you can even play c5 as early as the move after f4 is played. I do want to mention that I would advise castling the king first in many cases, but this is sort of just to show you can even play c5 here, and it's not a bad idea. So. With all that in mind, any other questions on e5, f4? Okay. What if black played c5 before white? Well, we'll talk about that one as well, but not in this game. I am going to mention an early c5. If you play something like c5 here, I should say, again, castles is going to be fine. Let's say e5, and there's just too much just to sort of hold together here for black. Let's say you try, let's say this move order, okay, I should say that probably bishop e2 is a better move against the immediate f4, so I'm going to stop putting this bishop on d3. Again, this is why I think Lawrence Trent's move order is the best, by drawing this bishop to d3 and only then going for this idea. So let's say f4, the immediate bishop e2, let's say e5, and kingside castles, and c5. So what's going to be the idea here, chat? What's going to be the idea here? White to move and actually nearly win the game. Nearly win the game. And yeah, Chess King has the right idea. You want to take one of these pawns. A huge source of play is not only the queen side, but the open d file. Again, the worst move in the position is d5. You know, even moves that hang pieces, I would rather see, you know, if I were teaching someone, I would rather see them play bishop e3 than d5. That's how much I hate this move. But d takes c5 or c5 takes back, and queen d5 is just going to be very, very powerful. Takes. And now with queens off the board, white has a protected passer, still has counterplay on the queen side. White is simply positionally winning in this case. So this is a good point to mention though. If you see the premature f5, I do recommend putting the bishop on e2 rather than on the d3 square to keep the d file open. And again, that's why I think this move order by Lawrence Trent is pretty clever, drawing the bishop to d3 first and then putting the pawn on f4. Okay, let us move on then. So as I said, our idea of playing knight f2 is oftentimes to take on e4 with the knight. Is knight g5 a blunder? Yeah, knight g5 just doesn't make sense. It's just going to get pushed away, and then there's no reason to put this knight here. But as I said, Oftentimes our idea with knight f2 is to take on e4. With that being said, there are of course going to be exceptions to this. So I wanted to take a look at one of those exceptions from a pretty high profile game between the one and only Wesley So against Daniel Naroditsky. And these players actually met in the 2015 United States Championship. So this was a high level game. And I think Daniel didn't do as much studying on this line as he should have, because Wesley So sort of took him to town on this one. And let's see what happened. So we start with our same opening moves. We get f3, castles, a3, takes, and knight h5, knight h3, f5, and again, knight f2 is Wesley's idea here. And now we've seen two moves that directly influence the center by black. We've seen d6 and we've seen knight c6. And the idea of both is to eventually play this move e5 and start fighting back for some of these squares in the center. That being said, I did say that white's main source of counterplay in the first game, if you remember, in let's say a position like this, is going to be going after this pawn on c4. This is a very common source of counterplay for black in these positions. Now, let's see what happens if black tries to go for that counterplay immediately with the move b6. Well, Wesley So continues with the move e4, and here Daniel plays the move f takes e4. And interestingly, knight takes e4, still a perfectly fine move for white. I should say that off the bat. Knight takes e4, not bad here at all. I think probably slight edge to white with the move knight takes e4. But in this particular instance, black has played a move that does nothing to influence the center, and because of that, white is simply close to winning after the move f takes e4. So what do I mean by that? Well, f takes e4 is of course the more combative move when compared to knight takes e4. Why is that? Well, you're simply threatening to take away this knight's only retreating square, and if you succeed in doing that, this knight on h5 is going to be a very, very bad piece. And this is what happened in the game, and Wesley So was simply close to winning out of the opening in this case. Daniel went queen to f6, trying to attack f2 and get some tactical threats going, and Wesley plays the cool, the calm, the collected rook a2, defending laterally. I love this move. Queen f7 by Daniel, trying to give the knight this square. Now knight h3 comes by Wesley So, and the hits are going to keep coming here. If you think you're going to get away with knight to f6, think again. These moves start coming, these moves start coming, these moves start coming. In the game, Daniel plays queen g6, trying to pressure this. Now e5 is taking away this square, and it really is just losing for black at this point. Bishop b7 was played, and perhaps the best move for white here is rook f2, but what Wesley did was enough for an advantage. He goes bishop d3, and you can see now that white is sort of just crushing in activity on the king side here. Doesn't really matter that the king's stuck in the center. White is just much, much better. So bishop b4 was played, and they went down this forcing line. Queen b1, queen c2, takes. Black succeeds in getting rid of some of these active white pieces, but is just left with the worst position. The game continued with g6, knight g5, knight over to e4, g4, and again this knight is a bit stuck. Knight f4, bishop e3, knight h3, rook g2, knight f4, and I don't want to get too into the nitty-gritty here, but basically Daniel felt the need to sacrifice this pawn. And the game did actually get interesting again, but the point was, at this moment in the opening, it's very, very clear that that black is pretty close to lost here. This is just a pretty bad position for black, and probably, again, Wesley had other ways to continue without trading the queens, going for a smaller advantage. Something like rook e2 would have been great, with, again, the idea to do this and get the king safe. But the point of the matter is, just because our idea is knight takes e4 doesn't mean f takes e4 is always going to be bad, and in fact, I think this is going to be a pretty good move in the case that black has wasted time and done nothing to influence the center, for example, with a move like b6. Other moves like this, something like a5 if your opponent played now after e4, if takes, again, f takes is going to be really good. And it might seem unrealistic to expect a move like b6 or a5, but if Danya's playing it in the US Championship, I figured it was worth at least briefly mentioning. So what was the point? The point is, if your opponent is wasting time, you can feel free to take on e4 with the pawn, with the point that you're going to have some very active play on the queen side. Why isn't this move as good after knight c6, for example? Well, let's take a look. Takes, and actually, I should mention, this probably is good after knight c6. That's why you didn't see Fedorchuk take on e4 immediately in game 1. And why isn't this good after, for example, d6, fe4, fe4? Well, now e5 is going to be more difficult to achieve with black already contesting this square. That's why the move b6 is what really allowed Wesley to go a little bit wild in this case. Okay, so questions on this idea before I show you a slightly important maneuver. All right, I am just going to move along. I've been answering too many questions. All right, so what's this important maneuver I'm talking about? Well, I'm just going to show you from a position, not from any game necessarily, but let's say perhaps we go down this path that we've been going down, knight h5, knight h3, f5, knight f2, d6, e4, and let's say that black plays the move knight f6. What's the point of this move? The point of this move is to combat our idea of taking on e4 with the piece by increasing the pressure to this pawn. Well, play can continue very naturally. We still want to go bishop d3, and after fe4, I still stand by this move. Knight takes e4. I think this is fine for white. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and black hasn't really stopped our idea. In fact, black has already traded off this defender on f6. However, now this idea of queen h4 check does become sort of a reality here. Why is it good here when it wasn't good before? Well, the point now is that our knight on f2 is missing, and after g3, this queen is actually able to come into h3 and start creating threats. So there's a very important maneuver that I wanted to at least mention if you find yourself facing this or any similar situations when you're taking on e4 with the knight. So chat room, what do you think white should be playing here? Give me white's next 3 moves to evict this queen. Give me white's next 3 moves. King f2. So king f2 is not gonna be it in this case. It's a little bit too much to be playing king f2. What's wrong with king f2? Well, I mean, maybe it's playable, but I just would rather not. This knight is probably coming here, and here, and here, and you've got some problems. There's a much better way to get rid of it. So yeah, you guys are starting to hit upon the idea here. You want to get this bishop back to this diagonal, and I think the best way to do it is to start with this move queen e2. You don't let this queen into g2, and the point now is that after white gets developed, or black gets developed, something like knight c6, you're actually going to play the move f4, and bishop g2 castles is coming pretty much unstoppably next. And this is going to be the idea for white that I'm recommending here. For example, the game could continue, something like bishop d7, bishop g2, queen f5, castles. Does this mean we've given up on our idea of counterplay along this diagonal? Not at all. We've just delayed it slightly to castle our king. Bishop e4 and bishop d3 with queen e4 ideas to follow are definitely still in the air, along with ideas of applying some pressure down these open central files. So I wanted to mention this idea at least. I think this is an important maneuver to keep in mind to get this queen out of your territory. What happens if black plays the move e5 here, trying to stop f4? This is a perfectly reasonable question. And I think the fact of the matter is, without the queen in the center, white can start to look to open things up a little bit, something like d takes e5, something like bishop d5 check, something like bishop g5, and this pawn is going to be a little bit of a weakness for black. I'm not saying white has some sort of huge advantage in this position. I'm just saying white has a target here, and eventually you can play something like queen f1 and something like queen g2, for example, to evict this queen out of your territory and end up castling as well. So e5 may be a good idea for black, but you can give black a little bit of a weakness and play with the bishops on an open board. What more can you really ask for? So aside from that, I do want to mention, if that type of position isn't really your cup of tea, there is one more idea here for white. I don't really like f takes e4 because, again, I think after e5, white is in a little bit of danger of becoming worse off. These positions, in my experience, are just very hard to play practically. But the move bishop c2 is actually going to be a good one for white. Point is, e takes f, queen takes f3, e5, castles, and white just plays the position a pawn down. The ideas are going to remain largely the same, but white has sacrificed a pawn for a little bit of extra time castling the king and developing the pieces. So this is also perfectly playable for white. Okay, so what was the point? The point was that we are playing e4 with knight f2 and taking with a piece. If black tries some line like knight f6, trying to make this difficult, we develop anyways, and we can take, and queen h4 check isn't so scary when we come up with this idea of queen e2, following up with bishop g2 in order to evict this queen from our territory and get castled. Okay, other questions? Other questions? Does black have anything that is easy to play for black and hard to play for white in the f3 Nimzo? All the variations seem like white has an easy position to play. Well, that's the point. That's the point of the lecture series. White is killing it in all the variations. White is killing it. However, I have sort of been avoiding the white whale of the f3 Nimzo, which is the move 4c5. So those lines, just as a heads up, they're going to get a little complicated. It's difficult to play sort of simple natural moves and be doing well, but I do think white has good chances in those lines as well. But if everything is looking too easy so far, wait for those c5 lines. It gets tough. All right, so there is one more idea I want to mention, along with this idea of the early knight f6, and that is, what if black plays the move c5 in this particular position, right? We looked at it in a few different ways, where c5 was never really working for black because we could take and play something like queen d5 to follow. But what if black just comes right out and does it in this position? Well, the fact is, it's not really going to change our ideas too much, and there is one pretty instructive game between Burks and some random 2300 named Berkovich. Interesting matchup there between Burks and Berkovich, but they just continued with e4, fe4, and in this case, because again, black has not played a move to control the e5 square, white captured on e4 with the pawn. And I think that's a pretty good rule. You take back on e4 with the pawn if black is doing nothing to control the e5 square. In that game, black played knight f4, and white played bishop e3. I do want to mention bishop takes f4. Again, great move for white in this case because the ideas are going to be largely the same. But the point is, black just doesn't simply have time to combine c5 and f4. And c5 without f4 just doesn't make too much sense because black should be focusing more on controlling the e5 square. All right, with all that in mind, I do want to spend the last 10 minutes sort of introducing the idea of knight e8. So this knight h5 idea, it's, I think, a relatively newer idea in that it sort of was never played until the past 10 years. But it's not the newest idea by any stretch. I think this one is sort of starting to fade from the limelight as its bite has largely been taken out by the myriad of options that white really has against it. So what's better than knight h5? Well, why not put all your pieces on the back rank? And that's what I want to talk about for the last bit of this lecture. So while I switch chapters here, knight e8. What is the point of knight to e8? Well, it's a little bit mysterious at first glance why black would want to play the move knight e8, but the point is simply to start controlling some more squares on this kingside a little bit earlier on, and we'll see some parallels why knight e8 ends up being useful. So what's the point of knight e8? Well, the point is you give white everything he ever wanted. You get to play e4 for free. No knight h5 winning a tempo to play f5 garbage. Queen h4 check is nothing here. You just play g3. And so at first glance, it's like, yeah, this is fantastic. White is doing great. But then you start reading the names of the people who play like this, and you see like Peter Lecko. If you ever see that Peter Lecko has played a line, you can sort of bet on that line as being okay for black, just as a general rule of thumb. The point is basically you go directly after this pawn on c4 from the get-go. You waste no time with black. You're not pretending to stop e4. You're not pretending to attack on the king's side. You are coming after this guy, and you are going to take this guy. For example, play could continue with bishop d3, bishop a6, knight h3. This is the main line that I'm recommending. Something like knight c6 is the idea for black. Again, every move is aimed at the purpose of attacking c4. Castles kingside, knight a5. Again, literally every move with the purpose of attacking c4. Queen e2, and now black should probably follow up with the move c5. The point being, we want to attack this pawn on c4 one more time. And here the line I'm going to recommend is still the main line. I think the theoreticians got this one right. The main line I think is the best for white with the move e5. And now black is sort of met with some tough decisions. There are a few different ways the game could go here, and I just wanted to introduce some of the main ideas. So the most common move, I think, is actually going to not be the best for black. So let's start with that. What is the point of e5? Well, the point is, let's say black passes, for example. Now you're going to be in a little bit of danger of getting destroyed on the king side by everybody's favorite Greek gift. Queen e4, for example, g6, queen h4, and there's simply no way to stop mate. So that's the point of e5, right? You got to look out after e5 because this Greek gift is coming, and it's coming with a force. So black's most popular move here is f6. Why f6? Well, you simply want to stop knight g5, thereby eliminating this idea of playing the move bishop takes h7. And here I'm actually going to take a page from my arch nemesis, Jonathan Schrantz. Jonathan Schrantz had been doing a lot of prep for a match against me involving the f3 Nimzo, and I myself have played this line with black in the past and still often do to this day. And I think that this line is pretty reasonable for black. I don't think black is too much worse. But, again, referring back to my hero Peter Lecko, who only plays good openings. But Jonathan came up with a pretty interesting idea here that I wanted to share with you. So the main line goes with bishop f4, and this was not Jonathan's idea. And after bishop f4, play might continue c takes d4, c takes d4, and d5. Now after d5, you're going to get e takes d6 by white. I think this is the best idea. Otherwise, you just get a trade on d3, eliminating a lot of this kingside pressure. And after this, you get a temporary pawn sacrifice for black, but black is likely going to regain one of these pawns in the center of the board, or at least get some very active play down the center of the board with this rook, right? And I think this line is going to be okay for black. It's very difficult to keep both of these pawns together. But Jonathan's idea was, why do you need bishop f4? I am just going to play the move rook a2 and respond to rook c8 with rook c2. And I think this is a very reasonable way to continue the game. Now, after c takes d4, for example, white's point is that you are simply not going to be able to take my pawn on c4. d5 is still going to be a playable idea for black. But now, if knight takes d6, queen takes on e6, for example, knight back to f7. The fact of the matter is we don't have this bishop on f4 just yet, but we have this extra defense on our c4 pawn, and we have some time, for example, to play rook e1 in this position. And what's going on here, it's sort of anybody's guess. We are well out of any theory that has been, you know, tried over the board by good players. For example, queen takes d4, knight f2 is coming, and white has the bishops, black has pressure on the c pawn, white has control of the e file. It's very much up in the air what's going on. I am going to talk more on this knight e8 idea next week, as well as introduce a few new ideas to the position as well. But I think that's about where we're going to call it here for tonight. So, with that introduction to knight e8, once again, chat room, turning it over to any questions you have, specifically on this idea of knight h5, and also on this introduction to knight e8. And again, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of knight e8 next week. I didn't want to bog you down with too many, you know, theoretical lines, because we already did a lot on knight h5, and that was the main idea for this lecture. So, chat room, questions on tonight's lecture? Question on tonight's lecture. Questions on tonight's lecture. Why doesn't white play bishop e3 instead of knight h3? Well, your idea is to play e4, and I guess your point is to play bishop to d2. I suppose this is playable, but the point is this knight is not going to be good on e2, right? Its square really is going to be on f2. And if you play something like e4 here, I mean, okay, even things like this sort of become an idea, right? I think it's not so much that the bishop is bad on f2, it's that the knight is bad if it doesn't have this f2 square. Why not go king h8? So we're down deep into the end of this variation here. I think we're talking about, let's see. Let's say not rook e2, but this, d5, sorry, take, and then d5, take here. Why not king h8? Well, this piece is hanging. And I guess if you're talking about this line, for example, let's say take, d5, take here, king h8. Knight f4 is sort of coming, and there are a lot of sacrificial ideas up in the air that you're going to have to be a little bit wary of. And that's all. Even here, knight f4 might still be coming, but the point now is that this is going to be a bit more of an issue, unveiling the threat of the queen. But again, we're going to get more into those lines next week. But that is going to have to be where I call it for tonight, as our time is dwindling. If you guys are watching live, please head over to the Twitch channel, where we are going to have another edition of Tactics Time. And if you're watching the YouTube video, please let me know what you thought in those comments. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.